Welcome to Stratford upon Avon, where Will and I are going to show you around some of the famous sights and sounds and maybe even smells of Shakespeare's England. So first off, we're going to head out to the village of Wilmcote, to Mary Ardens' home, the home of Shakespeare's mum. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Well, on a day like today, it's very easy to understand how Shakespeare wrote some of these beautiful words. So we're starting our journey today at Mary Ardens' farm. We're in a small village called Wilmcote, just outside Stratford upon Avon, and it was here that Shakespeare's mum grew up. It's also thought that Shakespeare may well have been brought out here himself to Wilmcote when there was an outbreak of the plague in Stratford. And so, for me, this feels like home. I spent a long time working here as a milkmaid, of all things. Very random experience to find out that somewhere in my deep and distant history there must have been something connected with the milking of cows. So Mary Ardens' farm is a living, working Tudor farm. So this is where I learnt what it really feels like to live as an Elizabethan, where Shakespeare came out of the history books and instead of being a historical character, became somebody who was real, a person that actually lived and existed and experienced life. So when Shakespeare writes about Greasy Joan keeling the pot, I know exactly what that feels like, because here all of the meals are cooked on an open fire. And I don't know if you've ever tried to wash lard out of a cauldron, but it's dirt that gets ingrained into the skin on your hands and into the smell of your hair. Also, there's a lengthy discourse in As You Like It about the manners in the court compared to here in the countryside. Touchstone and Corin have a very lively debate, with Corin saying how ridiculous it would be out here in the countryside to kiss hands like they do in the court, because here your hands are covered with the husbandry of animals. And having worked here as a milkmaid, I can definitely tell you what that feels like, and that I absolutely wouldn't be going around kissing anybody's hands. This also feels like home because it was where my children really started to connect with Shakespeare. They worked here as mini Tudors and had little tiny Elizabethan outfits. In fact, Natasha had reins on the back of hers. And here they also learnt how to collect the hens in at the end of the day and how to flip a sheep and cut her toenails. So you might be thinking that this doesn't look a particularly traditional Tudor type of building, and that's because it has cladding over the top of the wattle and door building underneath. So let's go round the corner to look at Palmer's farm and see what it would have been like in Shakespeare's time. So we've just come round the corner from Mary Ardens' home to this of their wealthy neighbours. This is Palmer's Farmhouse. And of course in Shakespeare's time it wouldn't have been quite so wonky. So wood was a very expensive commodity in Shakespeare's time, and you can see that the house was built to fit the wood that they had rather than to accommodate a growing family. So this bedroom here started off as a mezzanine with a very small doorway, and then slowly, as the family became wealthier, they built the other bedrooms upstairs. And it's here that you can really feel what it was like, the harsh realities of living here in the countryside, with the open fire in the kitchen belting out the heat in all seasons. And it's also here that my daughter Matilda did a project on the plague, and stood in her Tudor costume in the window and lowered a basket out of the window where supplies were put in it for her to haul back up again. It's also where you become acutely aware of the passing seasons, so nature's changing course untrimmed. So the winters were cold, they were dark, it was cold, it was drafty, and the summer too were full of work and looking after the animals and the harsh realities of living in a rural community. So I became a milkmaid here at Mary Ardens' farm because one of our calves sadly died, leaving a mum who was milk-bound and needing a bit of attention. And I will not forget the day when I opened one of the cauldrons in the kitchen to find the head of a pig staring back at me, a pig that a few hours earlier I'd been looking after and feeding the kitchen scraps. This is really where you learn how difficult it was to survive in this environment and how incredible it is that William Shakespeare survived at all. So now let's move on into Stratford-upon-Avon and to Shakespeare's birthplace. So here we are on Henley Street in Stratford-upon-Avon outside William Shakespeare's birthplace. This is the room here where William Shakespeare was born, the first of the children to survive the various incidences of childhood illnesses and go on to become the William Shakespeare that we know and love today. This home is an affluent home. It was the home of Shakespeare's dad, John Shakespeare, who became the bailiff of Stratford-upon-Avon, or the mayor. He was also a glove maker, and at the end of the house was the glove maker's workshop. So William was born here, he was born in this room, and then at the age of 5 he moved into the boys' bedroom when he was able to carry a candle without it going out or burning his hand. And when you visit Shakespeare's birthplace, you'll see the painted linen cloths on the wall. And the ones in this bedroom are a copy from the Golden Cross Inn in Oxford. They're white, covered with black images that show gargoyles and cherubs and all sorts of hideous types of imagery. So it's easy to understand when Lady Macbeth says, "'Tis the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil," when you see the painted wall cloths that William would have grown up with as a child. Again, here is where William starts to become a 3D person and not just a character from the history books. Here in the Glover's workshop, there are various different items that Shakespeare refers to in his plays. So in The Merry Wives of Windsor, someone is described as having a beard as full and round as a paring knife. A paring knife is a round circular knife that's used to scrape the leather to prepare it for turning into gloves. And the most famous reference, of course, see how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. And every now and again you might see an actor from the girls' bedroom performing that very scene out here onto the street. So this end of the building accommodated the glover's workshop belonging to John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's dad. And you might notice that this doorway is unusually wide. And that's because it was needed to pull a horse through from the street, delivering all the various things, the leather and items needed for the glover's workshop. There's no evidence of the vats of urine in the garden here that were needed, so that's why it was brought in from somewhere else. And that's exactly what we did a couple of years ago from the other side of this building in the garden. We pulled a horse straight through into this corridor, into the glover's workshop, laden down with panniers full of leather, and then back out again into the garden. And of course, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the apprentices and perhaps William himself would have been sent out into Stratford-upon-Avon to collect dog poo, because that's what was needed to rub into the leather. So you've got leather treated with vats of urine, although there's no evidence of those in the garden. They were certainly brought in that way, and then dog poo being collected by William and the other apprentices, so you can imagine exactly how it smelt. And of course, we're going to head down there later. You can just imagine William creeping like snail unwillingly to school as he headed off to the grammar school here in Stratford-upon-Avon. So here we are outside King Edward's School, which is still a school today. And in fact, Upstairs, this is where William Shakespeare was educated. As the son of the bailiff or the mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon, he would have come here for his lessons. It's still used by the students today. So every day until 11 o'clock, the students of King Edward School are taking their lessons in the same room as William Shakespeare took his lessons. So we'd have walked down the street all the way, 6 o'clock in the morning, done his lessons here, where we'd have learnt about reading, writing and rhetoric. So any of you who are thinking about doing one of the fantastic speeches from Julius Caesar, "Friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears," you're probably repeating a speech that Shakespeare may well have thought about in his lessons at the grammar school here. It's an absolutely fascinating building and brilliant to think that school children are still studying here today. So let's take a short walk across the road to Shakespeare's new place and see where our journey takes us next. So here we are outside the site of Shakespeare's family home, New Place, here in Stratford-upon-Avon. This was the second biggest house in Stratford. Shakespeare had truly made it. And this is where he and his family lived until his death in 1616, and from where his wife carried on the family business after that. So the house itself doesn't actually exist. It was knocked down by an owner of the house after the Shakespeares had all left. He was frustrated with people knocking on the door and saying, "Is this Shakespeare's house?" So the Birthplace Trust, they've revamped the gardens, they've turned it into the most incredible display of Shakespearean flowers, roses and a memorial garden, and they've tried to replicate what the front of Shakespeare's house might have looked like by putting in this absolutely fantastic doorway. So the last time I was here was when New Place reopened and Prince Charles came to visit. And the street here was filled with 3,000 people. What was absolutely fantastic was that we were able to teach the 3,000 people that crammed into this street a round from Twelfth Night. "Hold thy peace, I prithee hold thy peace." Separated the audience out into 3 groups and had them all singing an Elizabethan round whilst they waited for Prince Charles to come out. At which point my daughter ran from the back of the crowd and fell on her face in front of 3,000 people and completely upstaged us all. And if you ever come to visit New Place and listen to the exhibits here, you may actually hear the voices of my daughters recreating the voices of Susanna and Judith, Shakespeare's own daughters. So here at New Place is where we start to see the circumstances of Shakespeare's own life becoming intertwined in his plays. We don't know how many of the plays that he wrote here or down in London. He would have travelled back here at times of the plague. He was a very, very early commuter. And so if you look really closely at a play like Romeo and Juliet, for example, you might notice that the first half of the play is all about Romeo. But the second half of the play is all about Juliet and her relationship with her dad. Interesting then to note that at the time when Shakespeare was writing the play, his own daughter Susanna was about 12 years old. So whether they were going through the same sort of experiences or not doesn't matter. You've certainly got those same life experiences intertwined in Shakespeare's most famous play. Here we are at Holy Trinity Church, where Shakespeare's revels truly are ended. Just behind us is Shakespeare's grave. And on Shakespeare's birthday, every year, all the great and the good of the theatre and Shakespearean world gather here in Stratford for a parade. It starts off with the parade of the dignitaries and then the People's Parade, where all of the different elements of Stratford-upon-Avon come together to celebrate Shakespeare's life and death. Everyone gathers here at Holy Trinity Church to leave their sprigs of rosemary, for rosemary is for remembrance, on Shakespeare's grave, and then they head off to enjoy all the hospitality of this fantastic town. It really is a sight to behold. A few years ago they did a scan of Shakespeare's grave, and from what we're led to believe, there's no skull. Could there be some sort of conspiracy theory around that? We will never know. And of course, if legend is to be believed, our Will went out on a drinking session with his mates, caught a cold, and died several days later. Well, if you're the type of man who's going to build a pub on the back of his ancestral home, what better way to go? So we finish our journey here on the steps of the Swan Theatre, overlooking the River Avon here in Stratford, where the Royal Shakespeare Company constantly update and rejuvenate and perform Shakespeare's incredible plays in all sorts of different ways, shapes and forms. They're currently getting towards the end of performing all of Shakespeare's plays in one long continuous season. And who can forget some of the most iconic adaptations that they've done of the plays here? The Tempest, where they used some of the technology from Lord of the Rings, where Ariel was an avatar, and every time the actor walked off the stage, they had to stand in a square and recalibrate all of the bits of technology that he had on his costume. And of course, David Tennant's Hamlet, in which he held a skull. Alas, poor Yorick. And the skull was actually a human skull. It had been dedicated in the particular person's will to become a prop here at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and David Tennant was the first and only actor brave enough to use that as the skull of Yorick in his performance of Hamlet. So let's keep our fingers crossed that in the not too distant future we will be able to hold one of our wonderful finals here in Stratford in the Swan Theatre. So, if we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these shadows did appear. I really hope that you have enjoyed our walking tour of Stratford today, and that perhaps one day you'll be able to visit this beautiful town in person.